So, good evening. I hope you all had a good week. And tonight's topic is going to be the statements Viktor Orban made. I think that's how you pronounce his name. At this weekend's peace march in Hungary. And he gave a speech there, and he mentioned George Soros in there in an essay George Soros wrote in 1993. And this is not really a fact-checking here, but to put it that way, is both the people who say George Soros did not write this the way Orban said this are actually correct, and so is Orban with his conclusion, the way he basically shared it in his speech of what he is seeing happening in terms of NATO, of NATO's involvement in this war with the Ukraine and Russia, and his opinion of keeping Hungary out of it. So both sides are actually correct. So today, after I listened to his speech, Viktor Orban's speech, I went and I got the essay George Soros wrote and published on his website on November 1st, 1993. This is like 2 years after the Soviet Union collapsed, and so did Yugoslavia. And as a result of Yugoslavia collapsing into several separate states, that was not a peaceful procedure. And there were a lot of tensions among the different ethnic groups, and so far and so on. That got quite bloody. There was genocide involved. So the United Nations by 1992 had created a umbrella under the United Nations that NATO would starting to enforce the peace over there. And that was first to stop any weapons or arms delivery into Yugoslavia or the separate states now by sea or air, and to a certain extent by land, but that was very limited, which they could do at the beginning. Then they created a no-fly zone over Yugoslavia, over the former Yugoslavian territories, which was then enforced, and they shut down several airplanes by the, parties involved there, fighting each other, back from the Yugoslavian army and air force stock they had at that time. And that was about the time then when IFOR was established, IFOR. That was the boots on the ground of NATO troops in former Yugoslavia to keep these fighting different ethnic groups separated and to maintain some form of peace. And that transpired, I think, by 1995. So Soros wrote an essay, and that essay is titled The Future of NATO. And in this essay, he goes in there, he looks at Milosevic, I think was his name, the Prime Minister of Serbia, or of the former Yugoslavia, whatever government form was left there. He didn't look at them as a threat in his essay, a threat which would warrant NATO to get involved, because he looked at this in his essay that this would be right-wing nationalist movements which needed to be controlled rather than someone like Milosevic. This was before, when he wrote this, the full extent of the genocides committed by all parties in there was not fully publicly known at that point. The conflict also originated in the last year of George Bush Sr. and was then basically inherited by the Clinton administration, who took over on January, I forgot what date it was, January 21st, I think, of 1993. And George Bush Sr. left office. He had lost the election to Bill Clinton. And in that, then the Yugoslavian conflict got bloodier and bloodier as things progressed. So hence, NATO was now used as a peacekeeping force, something which had never been, which was never their intended purpose in the first place. But what Soros wrote in there, in one of his paragraphs, was as a possible future for NATO, since we had lost the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact as an adversary. What was the basis for NATO being in existence in the first place? There was, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, no real need to maintain NATO because it had outlived its purpose. The Cold War was basically over, but the NATO alliance still existed. So he wrote in there that his thoughts were that the NATO could be used as a partner for peace. That's what he called this. And this is sort of what, where it started from, but it came from the United Nations, actually. And George Bush Sr. at that time, with Helmut Kohl, who was still Chancellor Mitterrand, and in England, it was Margaret Thatcher, I believe, was still in power at that point in office. They had kind of concocted this. So all what George Soros did is took that initial UN mandate to NATO to start non-militarily enforcing the peace, basically by observing a no-fly zone and closing off the waterways for weapons deliveries, because that's where it really started. It wasn't a military engagement per se, but they were authorized to use force if necessary, which they did at a later point. But by the time Soros wrote his essay, they hadn't done so yet. There hadn't been a need for it. So this was now the blueprint. This is now the blueprint. And of course, the NATO got more and more militarily involved, and this whole thing culminated then in the more or less NATO war of 1999, which brought this whole thing to a closure. And then the I4 group became K4, I believe, and then it kind of ended. In Bosnia-Herzegovina is one NATO partner today, where the other ones aren't. And I don't believe any of these individual states. There is Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Slovenia, Macedonia, and now I think I forgot, but Croatia, I think. That is the 5 or 6 states which originated out of it, where ethnic groups of each state live in the other state, and that kind of caused all of this circus in the first place. Here, NATO, in this instance, had to deal with a weakly armed individual groups now, states, basically small states, and they were easily dominated. That didn't take much fighting, and there's not a lot of NATO soldiers which got killed in action. Some of them were wounded. And I think this was the first military action NATO had actually seen in its entire history, to the limited extent of what they did there. But this has basically now given us a precedence for the Ukraine. And at this point now, NATO has grown dramatically from where that was when the Yugoslav war, as it is generally referred to, started in 1992, 1991, 1992. And Orban now said, basically, because let me put it this way, first of all, before I go to what Orban actually said. The way NATO would work in this case, in a defense case, is that the country which is attacked takes care, because they're the closest to the battlefield, to the battle theater. They would basically take the lead in the defense, and then all the other countries come to the aid, you know. Now, in this particular case, the battle theater is in the Ukraine, in the eastern part of the Ukraine, in the western part of Russia, but it is actually on Ukrainian territory. The very closest NATO country to this conflict is Romania at this point, as a NATO member. They're just their border is just several hundred kilometers, a few hundred kilometers from Odessa and Crimea. So they would be technically, and then Hungary, the next country, those are the two countries which are the closest to the current front lines, basically, from NATO. So they would be required in a NATO scenario to basically move in there with their infantry and the cavalry, which today is the tanks and artillery and that sort of stuff. The other NATO countries then, like the United States, Britain, France, Germany, all of those who have specialized, highly specialized forces, like the United States Army has the 101st Airborne, they would immediately move in there as well to support the Romanian and Hungarian soldiers, front soldiers, basically, with specialized equipment, specialized operations, and that sort of stuff, until NATO has enough time to bring all of their stuff from what we call from the rear, heavy equipment from Germany, from France, from Holland, from Belgium, from all these member countries, through Poland, through Germany. There's quite some distance which has to be traveled to get all of this ready. This has to be, set in motion, this whole thing. So, and that is what Orban said, is that Brussels was planning this at this point, that the NATO troops would get involved on a peace basis. So not because a NATO member got attacked, but to maintain the peace, to aid the Ukraine. And that would require Hungary and Romania to bear the brunt in the very beginning of the entry of NATO into this conflict with soldiers. And of course, they will sustain most likely losses, and they might be significant, because Russia has gotten their military machine pretty much up and running, and it is increasing on a daily basis. But here, in comparison to Yugoslavia, we're dealing with a superpower, which not only is the largest country on the planet, but also has the most amount of natural resources, which means Russia can sustain this war technically and from natural resources, indefinitely, because they have coal, they have iron, they have aluminum, they have copper, they have rare earth metals, they have uranium, they have plutonium, they have everything you would need to do what they would to sustain a war. And the advantage is strategic, is Russia has a very developed, it may not be the greatest railroad network, but they have a very developed network even into the last corner of their country where those resources are. So the way they usually do this is they build the military equipment in these remote places and then ship them by railroad to the front line. And that has worked in World War II. That's when this whole thing was basically established on how the emergency plan, so to speak, would work. It took some time to set up. I think it took them about 1.5 years, 2 years, and they had some help from the United States at that point, but it happened. And that's how they were able to overpower the German Wehrmacht. And you're going to have a similar scenario here, except that the Russians have now a 2-year lead on this, at least 1 year lead in getting their war production going. That means they're changing the economy from a peace economy over to a war economy. And this is basically what we have been seeing. And the Ukraine is no longer able at this point really to defend themselves because of the power outages they have and that sort of stuff. So this is where Orban came in, and he said, Orban, yeah, that's his name. Orban said this would be Hungarian soldiers, of course, and the Romanians and Polish soldiers too, and the Slovaks. Those are the 4 countries which are the closest to the front lines, with Romania being the first one, Hungary second, Slovakia third, and Poland fourth. So that's how they kind of would come in, with everyone else then filling up the rear, basically getting the supply lines going, rearmament and air support and everything else. All the air combat is going to be started out of Romanian airfields and Hungarian airfields and Slovak airfields, because they're the closest. You want to have these jets as close to the front lines as possible, which in turn makes the Romanian airfields and cities then an immediate target for the Russian air defense system. And so will be Hungary and everyone else. So they're going to get immediate reaction out of Russia if they're going to get involved in this. And this is basically how he concluded this. Was the precedents we have here originated with the Yugoslavian war as a blueprint for NATO to be authorized to get involved in a war, even though it has no real interest in it other than keeping the peace and probably some economic interest in the country itself, which they're trying to help or to defend. On the other hand, is we have now a superpower, a nuclear superpower on top of it, which is now closer aligned to China, which was not part in 1991 when this Yugoslavian war situation, started and evolved. China was not on the map yet as it is today, as a superpower here as well, militarily and especially economically with manufacturing. So this all has shifted and changed. And I cannot blame Orban if he says, well, I don't want to send my people into this kind of a scenario. He also said that Hungary had already 2 wars with Russia, First World War and Second World War. The First World War was in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and then in the Second World War, they became part were overrun by the Wehrmacht going into this direction, and so did Romania. And certain pro-Nazi forces or people in Hungary and Romania, basically these pro-Nazi government officials, were installed by the Nazis after these countries were kind of annexed, so to speak. And they got involved in these wars then on that scale, and then they had to endure the Russians afterwards, so did Romania. So there's not a great, that is going to be a lackluster operation. And this is why Orban is correct when he says this is what he foresees. What he's basing this on is 2 things. The United Nations, which he did not mention, but he mentioned Soros. And Soros had that written up in his essay to keep or declare NATO to be a partner of peace alliance. And it would be that alliance which they're talking about, which would get involved on the side of the Ukraine in this conflict. There was another author I read by searching for this stuff from Soros who said, well, Orban said this, but this is not true. Soros never wrote this. That is correct. Soros did not foresee exactly that Hungary would be one day a part of NATO and then would have to fight the Soviet Union or Russia in this case. But you have to take this whole thing together as it evolved. So he didn't write, Soros did not write in the essay that NATO should get involved and do the K4 thing and that sort of stuff. All he wrote as a possible future use of NATO which became then true later on, was to use it as a partnership for peace, as he called it, alliance. And that has materialized. It was tested out and it created a precedence. It hasn't been used in that area before. But another side effect what came out of this was that NATO now being involved in a national conflict rather than a war in Yugoslavia, was the Middle East started to notice this. And this was the time when Taliban, what was that guy's name, Osama bin Laden, started to look into this, and this led the Taliban and Osama bin Laden to their planning and their fighting against the United States, because they saw Clinton and the Clinton machine behind the NATO change from a defensive force for Europe, basically Western Europe against the Soviet Union, which now has shifted into a freely usable large military force under the umbrella called a alliance or a partnership for peace. Technically speaking, it is kind of chewing gum. You can stretch this out to the limits, and you could then deploy NATO almost anywhere in the world under this concept. And this is a questionable, use of it. The charter, the NATO charter, when it was started in 1953-54, clearly stated that this was an alliance, a defense alliance, in a case that one partner was attacked, specifically at that time by the Warsaw Pact or by the Soviet Union. The Warsaw Pact then kind of started at the same time, 1953, 1954. And both alliances on either side, the Warsaw Pact or the NATO, were basically geared for each other. It was assumed at that point that the conflict or the war would start in Germany between East and West Germany. That means that East Germany and West Germany would have to, put up the German soldiers on both sides fighting each other, defending either the East going over to the West or the West coming over to the East, either way. And then the other countries would come to their support, basically. So the Soviets and the Americans were basically not really interested in fighting this out, but it would have come to a war between German and Germans from both sides, East Germany and West Germany, since that border or that main line was basically the dividing point between the Warsaw Pact and NATO at that particular point. And you have to understand this to understand why Orban made the remarks or why he decided to go that way. And I perfectly understand this, and I cannot blame him at all. If I would be in this position, I probably would kind of react the same way, because it is not exactly of what NATO was intended for. It was now a kind of a trying to figure out what are we going to do with this military alliance, which is the largest military alliance in the world, by countries and by soldiers and by weapons and everything else. He said Western technology with Eastern European soldiers. That would be correct, that statement. Again, it goes back is because the proximity of Romania especially, and then Hungary, to the actual current front lines in the Ukraine. They would be the first ones on the scene, so to speak. And with that, with Western weapons, basically. That is correct. There's no question about it. How far Brussels is in the 3 stages of what he described there, I believe he said they're currently in stage 2, which is the preparations. And then 3 is basically the implementation, the beginning of the involvement in this. This is basically the same way NATO got into the Yugoslavian conflict war. It was also in stages. It started here, there, and we have now the similar makeup in this. We have seen this with the types of weapons the West has delivered to the Ukraine, which has increased from more defensive weapons to more defensive weapons, which also can be used offensively. So this stuff is starting to change, and the Ukraine obviously is having a problems, not surprisingly, to recruit their men. I don't know if they also recruit women for the front lines to get into the military. So genuine mandatory draft, I don't know if they have called this out yet or not. I know from what I understand, I should not say what I know, is what I understand is there is like 1 million refugees, Ukrainian refugees in Germany at the moment. And there's probably a good chunk of able-bodied men in the age group, I would say from 18 to 40 in that 1 million who have escaped this, and there might be Ukrainians in other countries and so far and so on. So this is kind of on where we are with this. I personally do not think that the Ukraine will be able to pull this off unless there's massive arms deliveries coming from the West, and also even more so offensive weapons and weapons which are going to reach further and further into Russia. And the other question is, I do not know on how the Ukraine wants to deal with their mandatory draft situation, on how many soldiers they can get combat ready, recruits they can get combat ready in what time. It is very difficult to send a new recruit, say after 6 weeks of boot camp, right into battle. In World War II, they did this, after 1941 or so, when the United States ended the war. They had no other choices. The United States did it that way. Usually, and Germany had to do it that way. You don't want to get that untrained soldier into a combat situation, but if the shit is going to hit the fan, you have no other choice, you're going to do it. The casualties are a lot higher. From the reports from our Oberst Reisner in Austria, the Russian Federation has now 503,000 soldiers on the front lines at the Ukraine. So they have, in their draft and recruitment efforts, have been able to put a pretty good sized force there together, 500,000 men, and they're probably still actively recruiting and drafting. That means they could easily swell on to 1 million or 1.5 million soldiers. So we're looking at a very large military force there in terms of manpower. And again, as they have ramped up their wartime, they have shifted over to wartime production in Russia. The other thing is, what I learned today from Hungary is that the Hungarian economic minister spoke at a conference. I forgot his name. I could not remember his name, but he basically said that the Hungary will not obey the sanctions, and they will trade with Belarus the way they have been, and that trade, of course, is going to go over then to basically to Russia, what the Russian population refers to as parallel importing. And there's probably, I don't know how Romania deals with this, but Hungary is definitely the source where all of the merchandise and everything else is going to enter, originates from for Russia to wind up there through Belarus, through the parallel importing. So these are the interesting developments what we had here. There's also one viewer or one YouTube channel I wanted to mention. I think I'm going to put a link in. That is a lady in the Ukraine, and her husband was one of the first Ukrainian Air Force pilots who was shot down in 2014 already, when the conflict started in the Donbass. He was on a reconnaissance flight and he was shot down by the Russian military because the Donbass rebels didn't possess the kind of technology to bring down an aircraft in that size with the capability it had as a reconnaissance plane. And she has a channel. She started it a little while ago. Actually, she started her channel, I think, 10 days before Russia invaded the Ukraine. So that is quite interesting when you go back to the very first video she posted. And I like her videos because she shows the reality of the war in the Ukraine. That means the air raids, when the air raid sirens go off, when when they have the power turned off, and how life is disrupted, and they go out and they live in the country for a while, and they go back to Kiev trying to go to school, and how regular Ukrainians actually trying to maintain a regular life under these war conditions, which is very, very difficult. You cannot really call this propaganda. It gives you a pretty unfiltered view on this, which we don't see too often in the Western media. It gives us a better glimpse. Of course, there's many Ukrainian YouTubers out there who are celebrating even the smallest victory, which is good, and it is rightfully done so. But here in this particular case, we can actually witness the everyday impact the war has, even on the regular Ukrainians who are far away actually from the front lines, but yet have to deal with all the consequences of this war in their daily lives, and how they're struggling to maintain a regular existence, which is very difficult. The fears, the anxieties, the heartaches and everything else would come with it. And I was touched by this, and I think this is a very noble channel to say this. That is a very brave lady, what she is going through. She has 2 children from that marriage, being a widow, and so these things are all not easy. There's no question about it. I will put her link in the description of this video. You may want to look at this. Surprisingly, because the way she makes the videos, she does not have a lot of subscribers, maybe 5,000, 6,000. So, and her YouTube channel has been up now for 2 years. When you look at other YouTubers which have 100,000, 500,000, even 1 million, subscribers, which give you the scenic lifestyle in the country, and milking the cows and that happy horse shit, which is kind of out of touch. And then you're looking at someone who actually shows what real life is, and they get 6,000 subscribers. That tells you how deranged to a certain extent the YouTube viewership is. That people just don't want to see reality, or they can cope with it, or YouTube doesn't like to promote it, and it is not suitable for advertising. That might be probable or possible as well. Well, anyway, I will give you another update here as we go along, and I wish you a great week, and we shall see you.